Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. Welcome to this webinar. I hope you can all hear as well. If you cannot, please don't hesitate to drop a quick line in the chat box of GoToMeeting so we can help you with the IT problems. We would like you to please mute your microphones while the presentations are taking place. And we would also kindly ask you to note that this webinar is being recorded and that the presentation slides will be distributed after the webinar. I am Marisa Cardama, the Secretary General of the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, or the SLoCaT Partnership, might be easier and more known to some of you. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, also on behalf of the Islamic Development Bank. As you can see, this is a joint collaboration, and it is really the product of a fruitful ongoing collaboration that we have both institutions. This webinar is dedicated to the topic of low carbon transport for development. And over the next hour or so, we will be presenting and discussing with you the report on trends and recommendations for Islamic Development Bank member countries that has been authored by SLoCaT as an ISDB technical partner on sustainable transport. Joining me today on behalf of ISDB is Mohammed Ali IsDB, Manager of the Economic and Infrastructure Division in the bank. From the SLoCaT Secretariat, we also have Carl Pitt, our Research Director. But it's only fair to remember that there's been several other colleagues who have configured the team of data and policy analysts behind this report, including Nicola Mehdi-Moraj, Sudeep Gota, and Ali IsDB from SLoCaT, and also Ahmed Al-Kabani, Salim Refes, Olatunji Yusuf, Said Mohammed, Amadou Tieno Diallo, Mai Ali Babikar, or Dr. Walid Abdel Wahab from the ISDB. The way the webinar is going to work is that we will have two interventions, first from Mohammed from the ISDB and then followed by Carl Pitt from SLoCaT. And after that, we will have ample time for questions and discussions with you that we would kindly ask you to input directly in the chat box. So from the IT controls, we can actually facilitate the discussion afterwards. So with no further ado, and in the interest of time, I'm going to give the floor directly to Mohammed Al-Jased, Manager of the Economic and Infrastructure Division of ISDB. Mohammed, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Marisa, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us and for taking the time to attend this webinar. I hope you'll find it helpful and the information that we'll share it of use to you. And I really would like to start by thanking our partner in SLoCaT. It's been really a very fruitful working relationship, and we really appreciate all the support and all the information provided. And from our side, I think Marisa already mentioned all my colleagues, but really special thanks to my colleague Ahmed Al-Kabani, who's currently leading the Climate Change Division, which has been newly created. He's been really doing an amazing job in the last year since they established this division in bringing a climate change into the DNA of the bank in every sector, and especially in the transport sector. So really thanks to everyone, and we really hope this report will make an impact and difference in the way we look at the climate change issues and the way we plan forward in transport and the impact of the climate change. It's worth just to pause over here and look at the statistics that we have from UNDESA, that by 2050 the world population is expected to reach 9.7 billion. Out of which 68% expected to be living in urban area. So this a huge population need a lot of mobility solutions, and we all know that the transport is one of the main contributors to the emissions. And if we continue to do business as usual, it is expected that the emission will be doubling. So it's a very serious contributor to the climate change impact, and that's why we really take the climate change aspect very seriously in our transportation solutions, because that's one of the major contributors that we can change it. A lot of things when we design mobility solution, freight transport, and we're trying to avoid the increase of car ownership. All these aspects, we try to take it in the newly approved transport policy, which will be very soon posted on our website, along with the new also climate change policy that has been approved. So having said that, I don't want to further do the presentation of the information and the report. Again, thanks to our colleague, and we hope that this report will really help us to look differently at the variety of membership that we have. IDB have 57 member countries, all the way from Indonesia to Suriname. So we have different income subgroup, we have different climate resilience subgroup. So we really believe that this report will significantly help us. Without further ado, I'll turn it back to you, Marisa, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Mohammed, for that kind introduction and for reminding us really that key aspect of the variety of Islamic Development Bank member countries, and how I believe that variety actually helps us explain how sustainable transport will be key to connecting people, communities and jobs, schools and healthcare, delivering goods, services to rural and urban communities, how this quest towards sustainable low carbon transport goes very much beyond an environmental concern, though it is obviously core to it, but actually is a developmental concern and allows us to touch into the different pillars of a development approach. Precisely for SLoCaT, this type of work is an integral part of our contribution to the synergistic and integral or integrated implementation of both the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development from the perspective, of course, of transport decarbonization. Before I give the floor to Carl, our research director in SLoCaT, to introduce to you the main findings of the report, I wanted to perhaps ask you to consider while you're listening to the presentation, and hopefully afterwards you check the slides again, because we will distribute them, and you go and download the report if you would like to. You think about it as a tool as we all prepare towards the high-level political forum that reviews the SDGs, and as we all prepare as well towards the next generation of national determined contributions in the Paris Climate Agreement. Let's not forget that there are regional forums that help us prepare the HLPF. There is also the in-country work towards the voluntary national reviews that are afterwards presented at HLPF, and there's HLPF itself, the high-level political forum, and there's all the parallel work as well on the national determined contributions. So for us, this report and our ongoing collaboration with ISDB is very much in the spirit of providing technical support, providing knowledge analysis towards all these processes, and supporting the countries in these elaboration and monitoring and review processes. So now, really, with no further ado, so we don't need to have more time on the presentation of these very juicy findings of the report, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Carl Peet, our research director in the SLoCaT Secretariat. The floor is yours, Carl, please. Carl, we may need you to unmute your microphone. Bear us with me a moment with all of us while we...
Hey, better now?
There you are. Now we can hear you, Carl. Hello again. Welcome. Go ahead, please.
Okay, hello again, everybody. And take two, let me reiterate my brief introduction. Thank you very much, Marisa, for passing the mic my way. Thanks to Mohammed and all at Islamic Development Bank that have been mentioned, and other collaborators in this, what we feel is a very exciting project. And so with that, I have the pleasure to, in the following slides, give an overview of the content and structure of the report. And as you see here on this slide, the report is divided into 7 main sections. The first 2 of these sections are focused on those variables that drive transport demand and the emissions and other impacts that result from that demand across the 57 member countries, as Mohammed had mentioned. Parts 3 and 4 of the report focus on policy responses to these emissions and of course the transport activity, both on the side of mitigating carbon emissions from the transport sector and also adapting transport systems to increasing extreme climate events. And with the final 3 sections of the report, we're focusing on some specific topics that are related to transport and climate change, which include urban transport, passenger and freight transport, and also road safety, as these aspects go very much hand in hand with making more efficient and low carbon transport systems across the region. So on the right side, you see the report cover noting that the report includes a broad array of figures and tables coming out of this analysis, some detailed annexes and reference tables. And in particular, I would just like to highlight what's noted at the bottom of this list, the 57 country fact sheets, which are included in the annex of the report. So these are very detailed profiles for, again, each of the 57 member countries. Just to illustrate here, I'm pointing to the fact sheet of Afghanistan, which is first alphabetically among member countries. And just to point out the various pieces of these fact sheets or country profiles, we profile at the top general demographics. We look at transport activity, again, the drivers of the demand that I had mentioned earlier, motorization and other factors. We're looking at both historic and projected transport emissions arising from various consumption patterns. And so you can see in the lower right, a number of bars here that represent, as mentioned, historic emissions patterns from the transport sector, as well as projected emissions under both business as usual scenarios in the dark green bars and low carbon scenarios under the lighter bars. The second part of the fact sheet, couldn't squeeze it all into one slide. This helps to describe the various mitigation responses that have been identified for each of the member countries, as noted in the second to last section of this country profile. And the bottom piece looks at adaptation, activity, and vulnerabilities. So we feel that this is an important resource to help set baselines among the member countries, and of course the country, or I should say the Islamic Development Bank offices, to help to prioritize investments and policies for low carbon transport. And with that background of the country profiles, I will dive into the first section of the report, which is, as noted, focuses on transport drivers and demand. And so in doing so, we established a number of variables here to really, again, to create a baseline for the analysis that follows. We can note here, actually not noted on this slide, is the fact that the 57, the member countries, account for about 24% of global population, and this corresponds to about 22% of global urban population. At the same time, the member countries account for about 8% of global GDP, as you can see on the spoke of this graph, the vertical spoke at the top of the slide. At the same time, these countries account for about 15% of global CO2 emissions, about 18% of transport black carbon emissions, which affects both local and global, or has both local and global impacts, and roughly 25% of global traffic fatalities, just to name a few. We also note that in many member countries, population growth is increasing rapidly, and urbanization in particular is proceeding at a very rapid pace, with some of the most urbanized regions in the world, including the Middle East and North Africa region. And so in looking at these drivers, this is really a precursor to the various pieces of the analysis that follow. The second part of the report focuses on transport emissions. And with this slide, again, we can create a bit of a baseline for both historic and projected emissions among the various subregions, as you can see here by the various color slices in each of these bars. And so from this, we can make a few key observations. The first is that transport emissions under, and I should note that this is a business as usual scenario projections. This is really in the absence of aggressive implementation of low carbon transport strategies. And so from this, we can observe that emissions are expected to roughly double between 2020 and 2050 across the member countries, as noted. And another very important outcome, or observation, I should say, from this piece of the analysis is that the countries producing these transport emissions across these subregions are expected to be much more diversified as we move toward 2050. Currently, we observe that about 50% of transport CO2 emissions are produced by just 4 countries in the region, which include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Indonesia, and Turkey. And so as this gets to be a more diversified field, if you will, the question remains how best can we rein in transport emissions while encouraging economic growth. And in attempting to answer this question, we have created here a correlation between, or tracked the coupling, as it were, the correlation between GDP, which is represented by the black line in the graph, and transport, carbon emissions from transport, which is represented by the gold line. And the green bars in the background represent the degree of coupling, which is the positive bars, those that rise above the x-axis, and decoupling, which is more desirable, which are the bars that dip below the x-axis. And so as we see that this is an average across the member countries, we can see that these two variables are very closely correlated, very closely coupled. At this point, we're seeing important signs of decoupling as we get toward the right of the graph, which is encouraging, but it remains a challenge and a priority to increase the decoupling, to further decouple these two factors. At the same time, we're seeing very encouraging examples from within the member countries. And in this case, we can illustrate the trend within a specific country, Uzbekistan, which has managed since about 2003 to show a more steady increase in GDP and a slow and steady decrease in transport CO2 emissions. As you can see, that those bars are all moving in a negative direction, which is more desirable. So this is due in part to the fact that Uzbekistan is increasing its rail network and electrifying parts of this network, that fuel prices are above global averages and Islamic Development Bank averages as well. So again, this is an encouraging example that we feel can be emulated by other peer countries within the sub-region. Section 3 of the report focuses on transport mitigation policy responses, as noted. And in investigating this area, we are looking to the nationally determined contributions, also known as NDCs, that have been submitted through the UN climate process by 55 of the 57 member countries of the Islamic Development Bank. And with the two bars to the left of the slide, we see that nearly 40 of these NDCs highlight the transport sector. So about 70% of those submissions highlight transport as a mitigation source. At the same time, as we see from the bar on the right, a much smaller number of countries has established specific targets for mitigating emissions within the transport sector. I should note that these ratios correspond roughly to global averages, so the member countries are not alone. But we see that in the table to the right, we're highlighting a few notable examples of these targets. First, we see direct reduction targets for setting a specific target for reducing transport sector emissions. We see this from countries such as Bangladesh, from Cote d'Ivoire, from Gabon. In other cases, we see conditional targets in which reduction ambition is much greater, assuming outside support, and we see this in the case of Burkina Faso. And finally, we also see indirect targets in which countries are targeting not specific reductions or specifically quantified reductions of transport emissions, but focus instead on shifting modes from private to public transport and increasing the efficiency of the mode share, as we see here from Brunei Darussalam and from Palestine. So it's encouraging to see this ambition, to see these targets being set, as we observe that targets can really be an important factor in accelerating the pace and scale of implementation of these low carbon strategies. Diving in just a little bit deeper into the NDCs, we can see here that we can focus on the specific attention to different transport modes and transport subsectors within the NDCs. So the two bars on the left represent attention to passenger and freight transport. And we can see that freight is, or I should say that passenger is mentioned really 3 times more often than freight transport within the NDCs. This despite the fact that roughly 40% of emissions among the member countries, transport emissions and mode share, come from freight transport. So I'll return to this in a later slide, but this is an observation that attention is not necessarily proportional to the impacts of these two transport modes. Looking to the bars to the right, we also see that there's significant focus put on urban transport, also a fair degree of emphasis on heavy rail in the NDCs of the member countries, and relatively less focus on other strategies such as high-speed rail and shipping and aviation efficiencies, as well as walking and cycling. So again, these are observations to sort of set baselines and also to illustrate the potential really to optimize attention to these various subsectors in order to optimize the overall mitigation potential of the transport sector in these countries. A fourth section of the report focuses on transport adaptation policy responses. And with that, I would establish the fact that a large number of the member countries are vulnerable or extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And this map focuses on the vulnerability of human habitat to climate impacts, which includes as well infrastructure, which in turn incorporates transport infrastructure. So we can see here that roughly half of the countries display a high vulnerability to climate disruption, and nearly a quarter show a very high vulnerability. And so this really makes an important point, that is, it is essential to adapt transport systems within the region to make them more resilient, to make them more adaptive where they exist, not only in order to extend the useful life of the transport investments, but also to help reach the full mitigation potential as described in the previous slides. Again, diving a bit further into the adaptation policy responses, we are examining here 3 different channels by which adaptation is tracked within the UN climate process. The first of these is the NDCs, which I've described in previous slides, which also include an adaptation component. The second are the National Adaptation Programs of Action, also known as NAPAs, which are produced by least developed countries for shorter term measures, and National Adaptation Plans, also known as NAPs, which show the longer term planning process for developing countries. And so again, against the backdrop of 55 submissions, 57 countries, we say that there's relatively little attention given to adaptation in these various channels. But once again, in the table to the right, we see some very important examples of member countries that are focused on adaptation as relevant to the transport sector, which include Bangladesh, focusing broadly on climate resilient infrastructure, which also includes transport. Maldives is focused on increasing resilience of its aviation and shipping sectors. And Pakistan is looking to balance not only the resilience of its infrastructure, but also the resilience of its transport operations management. So very important to balance both of these aspects. So again, we see here very encouraging examples. And also, this also underscores the potential to increase adaptation planning within the transport sector. Turning now to section 5 of the report, which describes urban transport, I will, in 2 slides, describe a few different slices for assessing the current situation, implementation situation of urban transport across the member countries, and the interest and potential in expanding this in the future. Here we see 2 different maps, the top of which focuses on urban rail systems, including metro and light rail, and the bottom focused on bus rapid transit systems, BRT, across the member countries. The dots in this map, noting the cities, correspond to existing networks, with the darker dots corresponding to broader networks, as you can see here. And the country shadings indicate countries for which these aspects of urban transport are highlighted within their NDCs. So these are either intended or forthcoming contributions through the NDC process. And as we can see here, they're very important examples. There's a rich network in various ISDB subregions, and also we see some gaps in the landscape as well. A lot of interest in implementing bus rapid transit, for instance, in West Africa, a very high concentration of urban rail in North Africa and the Middle East, and in parts of Central Asia and South Asia as well. We see very recent examples coming online, some of which are not represented in these maps. We've seen a new tram line coming online in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, a new BRT system in Multan, Pakistan, and ongoing projects, tram and metro projects in Doha, Qatar. So although we're seeing very important momentum, we also see the need to increase and accelerate the scope and pace of this development, simply in order to keep up with urbanization trends and in order to meet the goals of the ambitious goals, I should say, of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Another aspect of urban transport is looking beyond the infrastructure built and planned to the development of sustainable urban mobility plans, also known as SUMPs. And these are comprehensive planning tools that help to integrate urban and territorial planning and design, and to bring in the planning of an array of transport modes in a participatory process. We see, although not noted on this map, we see that SUMPs are very well established planning tools in European cities, and less well represented really in all other parts of the world. We see from this map a number of SUMPs that are concentrated across the member countries, especially in North Africa, in the Middle East, and some other examples in a few of the other subregions. And so again, as these are a very important process or a very important tool, we feel, for establishing vision and setting up implementation, we see potential for more support for SUMPs and more activity as supported by the UN system, by multilaterals, and also by national governments to help to extend these important peer examples to other subregions. The sixth section of the report focuses on passenger and freight transport. And this figure is divided into two parts. On the left in the green box are the member countries for which these data are available. So we've captured each of those with, as mentioned, with available data. The red or orange box to the right captures the passenger and freight transport split for a number of peer countries and regions, and where the two boxes come together, you can see both the global average and the average of the Islamic Development Bank member countries. In each of these cases, we can see that freight transport accounts, this actually focuses on mode share, but there is a fairly strong correlation with emissions as well. So freight transport accounts for roughly 40% of transport activity, and passenger roughly 60%. Within this, we see quite a large variation among the member countries. For instance, there are countries with very high passenger shares. As you see here, Maldives and Indonesia, 80–90%. This is due in part to the fact that much of the freight coming into coastal and island countries is through international aviation and shipping. This is not reflected in these data, so we do have some limitations there. And on the other hand, we see countries with very high freight shares, for instance, with Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, others that tend to be landlocked and tend to contain many major freight routes between Asia and Europe. So the takeaway here is really that passenger and freight must be tackled in proportion to their impacts. And so again, coming back to the NDCs in an earlier slide, we would suggest that, again, that proportional attention be given to each, and that forthcoming revisions to NDCs and other plans can increase the focus on green freight measures, such as shifting freight transport from road to rail, or considering the use of electric vehicles and alternative fuel vehicles, especially in urban areas. A final section of the report focuses on road safety. And as shown in one of the initial slides, we note that the member countries have a slightly above average rate of traffic deaths. And it's significant to note that while road traffic fatalities have plateaued globally, traffic deaths are increasing in many of the member countries noted here. For instance, in Kazakhstan, and this is often seen in tandem with increases in motorization in these countries. For instance, in Kazakhstan, the motorization rate grew by nearly 120%, and the fatality rate, the road traffic fatality rate, increased by nearly 100%. We're seeing examples of countries in which road traffic fatalities are decreasing in this period of 2000 to 2013. These include Albania, Brunei Darussalam, Guyana, and Suriname, but these are the exceptions. And so conclusion here is that it's really essential to make transport systems within the member countries not only more efficient, but also safer for all segments of the population. And recapping these 7 sections, we have come out with a number of key report conclusions, which we'll take in turn here. The first is that motorization among the member countries must be countered with measures to stabilize car ownership and use. And we're seeing some success in that in countries such as Lebanon and Qatar, which have in fact decreased their motorization rates over the period that we're tracking. The second is that growing emissions must be coupled with low carbon transport low carbon transport investments, which can also help to increase social cohesion and equality as well as prosperity. And we're seeing this in a number of countries, as noted in previous slides. A third conclusion is that more ambitious mitigation action is needed for transport to make a proportional contribution to the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement. And again, we see that with the mitigation targets in the countries mentioned, such as Bangladesh, Cote d'Ivoire, Palestine, and others. The fourth is that adaptation and resilience measures must be mainstreamed within transport infrastructure and services to reduce vulnerability and also to improve lives and livelihoods. And we see that in countries such as Bangladesh, Maldives, and Pakistan, as previously mentioned. A fifth conclusion is that investments in urban mass transit must be accelerated to keep pace with projected growth and urbanization. And we're seeing this emerging in multiple cities, for instance, in Algeria with light rail and in Iran with metro. Very encouraging to see the rollout in multiple cities, not only in the capitals and the mega cities, but in secondary cities as well. A sixth conclusion is that freight transport requires further attention within the member countries. And as noted before, especially in those landlocked countries with high freight mode shares. And a seventh, I think not mentioned in this slide, is that bold and rapid action is needed to increase road safety measures across income groups. And again, we're seeing success in the countries mentioned in the previous slide, and also countries such as Bangladesh, which are making this explicit within their NDC. I should say road safety goals as well, to be pursued in tandem with climate emissions goals. Each of the conclusions in the previous slide have given rise to specific recommendations of areas for further work. And so touching on these very briefly, in order to increase access and equity of low carbon transport systems, we would recommend to encourage the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies where these still exist, and to support the development of sustainable urban mobility plans, as earlier discussed. To increase investments in low-carbon urban transport, we recommend facilitating the sharing of good practices on urban transport, especially for those countries where they're identified in NDCs, and to prioritize funding for those countries and cities experiencing very rapid urbanization. To address growth in vehicle ownership, we recommend supporting implementation of vehicle restrictions as noted in some of the NDCs of the member countries, and also to consider funding of electric vehicles and charging infrastructure in order to increase the efficiency of existing and emerging fleets. To increase transport mitigation ambition, we recommend conducting workshops to increase ambition of transport measures in NDCs, also as described in previous slides, and to support the development of mitigation potential studies where gaps exist. And finally, in order to mainstream resilience measures, we would recommend encouraging and supporting completion of NDCs and national adaptation plans with strong transport components, and also to incorporate resilience measures into all lending on transport infrastructure and vehicles. And in closing, I would like to describe some of the ongoing research that has arisen from the recommendations of the report that I have just summarized. And so to describe this ongoing cooperation between the Islamic Development Bank and the SLoCaT partnership to explore the nexus between climate change and sustainable development goals. With that, just a bit of context. The figure you see to the left of the graph here is really making the point that sustainable low carbon transport is essential to achieving at least 8 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, also known as SDGs. This is represented in the center ring. 8 different goals as noted here, including climate action, clean water, sustainable cities and communities, and other goals. And although there's not a specific SDG that's devoted to transport, we capture here in the middle ring some of the SDG targets, associated targets, for which transport, sustainable transport is really directly linked to achieving each of these targets. For instance, in fuel subsidies, urban access, road safety, and others. And the outer ring represents those SDG targets for which sustainable transport has an indirect impact on achieving that target. So although we're seeing a very significant overlap between the Paris Agreement targets and the Sustainable Development Goals, we feel that these processes could be more closely aligned. And with that in mind, again, building on top of the current report, we are examining synergies between these two processes, and we are in the process of developing a guidance of how these processes can be more closely connected. In doing so, we're conducting a deep dive study on 6 of the member countries. I should say we're looking broadly across the member countries, but looking specifically at the 6 that are identified here. They represent a number of subregions and income groups, as earlier described. And these countries were chosen specifically for the fact that they will all be submitting this year what are known as voluntary national reviews, VNRs, which help to measure progress and report on progress toward a specific subset of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so with this table, we're looking broadly at how transport has been captured in NDCs, how it's been captured in previously submitted VNRs, which and looking also at creating a guidance for those countries that will be submitting their first VNR in 2019. Finally, we're looking ahead to potential areas to apply this guidance, exploring possibilities for a workshop in the spring of 2019 to apply these findings, and also looking to opportunities to participate in the high-level political forum in July 2019 in order to raise the profile of transport within the 2030 agenda. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions, or continuing, I should say, the discussion in the next part of this webinar, and I will pass the mic back to Marisa.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thanks to you and also to our participants for this marathon, because indeed we understand that it's been a marathon of data and of information. Thank you, Carl, for taking us through so many pages of our report and so many months of research and analysis so succinctly. Colleagues joining us in the webinar, the floor is yours. We would really love to hear any questions you may have, any reactions, any comments you might want to share. The easiest tends to be if you can type it in the chat box, as my colleague Nicola has been encouraging all of us to do during the presentation. But you can equally request the floor through that chat, and we can open the microphone for you. So please take the opportunity. We would love to hear you. And don't be shy. Otherwise, we have a couple of questions, of course, that we could like to prod a bit more from both Mohammed and Carl. But yeah, we wouldn't like just for you to leave the webinar feeling that you've been talked at. Hopefully, that you've also been able to interact a bit with us. I see Ahmed Al-Kabani. I don't know, Ahmed, if you're wanting to take it. Please go ahead, Ahmed. Lovely to hear you.
Hello, hi everyone. I think for me, the only thing is if anyone has any observations or any comments about further work. I think one of the colleagues on the webinar is Salim Rifas. Also, he wants to have some comments and observations, the conclusions, because he took part in writing the report, as you know, from Islamic Development Bank. So I don't know if Salim is connected via audio, but he could also comment here. He sent me this observation. He wanted to make it about the car ownership. Us not wanting to reduce car ownership per se, but compared to business as usual. So not to limit growth, but rather slow down the booming in slow down that boom in single car ownership. I think this was mainly the thing that he wanted to flag. Also, if anyone would like to give us some insights, as you know, we're continuing the cooperation on this, taking it further and trying to zoom in a subset of countries for key policy recommendations. So if anyone has any observations or any recommendations regarding how to zoom in for the next stage of cooperation, they're most welcome. I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks very much, Ahmed, for joining and for, it's lovely to hear you. We've been working with you over the months and you and your colleagues, so it's lovely that you make that point. Other participants, other colleagues that would like to make a point, raise any question. Of course, there'll be the opportunity for continuing afterwards, in the sense that the teams stay and any technical questions can be covered as well afterwards.
Marisa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, everyone. This is Bertrand Magnet from Sustainable Energy for All. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and the very rich document. So, as you know, SE4All is starting an activity on transport, and the information you're sharing with us today is most relevant for us to design our own activity. So I have one question in particular, which did not really touch on during the presentation, but I saw a couple of tables which caught my attention in the report itself. I'm referring to the tables 8, 9, and subsequently on page 38. Those tables give the main measures by country, and I was wondering if those measures reflect the NDCs or the country commitments in general, or if you came up with a methodology to identify the most relevant measures, in particular for urban transportation.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Bertrand, for joining us on behalf of SE4All. Lovely to have you around as well. In the interest of facilitating a bit the discussion, I'm going to take other two questions that I see are queuing up and have been posted through the chat and also through our internal discussions here. So just to make sure that that both Mohammed and Carl can mull over them, we have Edgar Salinas from the Development Bank of Latin America, who's telling us that the correlation between NDCs and the state of the art for the transport sector in the region is a great progress at the strategic level. In the context of further research on SDGs, does SLoCaT intend to assess externalities such as health, productivity, air pollution? This could facilitate the dialogue at the political level. A similar question or a similar comment, I think it's made by Alan Octavio Vera Velasco, who's thanking us for the informative presentation, and he's wondering if we are also working on such work in Latin America, and how are we doing, how are we replicating this successful partnership with ISDB in other regions? Just for completeness, there is another comment from the Bashish. She's thanking Carl for the excellent presentation and would like to observe that infrastructure, such as the right design of streets for walking and paths for cycling, can drive the mode share to a sustainable low-carbon transport. It's also important that electric mobility is promoted in conjunction with better urban planning, which is a phenomenal point, Devashish. Thanks very much. That kind of usual lack of integration between urban planning and urban design and urban mobility tends to impede really the development of low carbon mobility options. Over to Mohammed first, perhaps, and to Carl afterwards to take this. Perhaps Mohammed, if I might adapt a bit some of the questions we've heard regarding Latin America, since in your case you are speaking on behalf of the Islamic Development Bank. I would like to ask you, how would you say that this type of report can actually help the countries in the country offices, the ISDB offices, to work directly with member countries, in case this can be interesting as well for our colleagues from other regions to hear. Please, Mohammed. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Marisa. As you all know, in the beginning of last year, 2018, we did a decentralization. So now we have an office in Suriname. It's still a virtual office. It has not, moved there. But the intent is, of course, as you've seen, the challenges in South America is a bit, different than the rest. But I think the report clearly highlights, the resilience part over there. I think one of the things that we can always benefit of is we have a program here at the Islamic Development Bank called reverse linkage, where if we find a solution that works in certain part of the member countries, we can always get together the experts and we can see what can be replicated in that region or not. In looking at South America, at some point we were looking for the freight movement. They're both coastal countries, and how we can benefit from that and how we can have a more cost-effective means of transporting goods. You've seen in Central Asia how the landlocked countries, they do have a different ratio when it comes to passenger versus the freight. So I think that's one of the things that we want to see, how we can make that more benefiting the economy. Again, taking into account the climate change aspect, taking into account the resilience part of it, and how to add to that the economic development, and how we can gather all of these together in financing solutions. We like to call them solutions. It's not only about infrastructure; it's infrastructure that takes care of a climate change and induce economic activity. So this is again what comes to mind. We are open. We are currently in dialogue with the countries, and we're trying to see all possible solutions in that region.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Carl, if you remember, we had a couple of comments that perhaps you could be best positioned to address. We had Bertrand wondering about some of the figures that were presented on the slides. Devashish commenting on the impact of urban planning and design and electric mobility. Edgar and Alan wondering about what type of work do we do in the Latin American region, and to what extent we try to incorporate and assess externalities such as health, productivity, and air pollution. Over to you to make a mix of those and try to address them, please, Carl.
Okay, thank you, Marisa, and let me try to be concise but touch on each of those questions very briefly. I think first there was a specific question about tables 8 and 9 in the reports. For all of those who have it in front of you, but specifically these are focused on and this is a piece that I actually did not touch upon in the presentation, as certainly there's a lot of material to cover, and this I think takes a bit more time to absorb. But this is the case in which we are looking at, we're really making sort of an assessment of relevance of various low carbon transport measures to the various subregions. For instance, under transport demand management, we're looking at perhaps the relevance of solutions such as congestion charging zones, vehicle restriction policies, sustainable urban mobility plans, as previously mentioned. And so a bit of a technical question, but just to give you the background, we assess this broadly. Again, these are very, very broad assessments, but this would be based on various patterns of urbanization, projected growth, income levels in some cases, the motorization rates, and the existence of existing infrastructure, whether it be bus rapid transit or urban rail and other infrastructure solutions that are currently existing. And so again, I would refer each of you to the report itself to look at these broad really assessments of relevance of these various solutions. But again, this is based on a number of variables in the backgrounds, in addition to simply what has been stated within the NDCs of these various countries. Or I should say, as these are sub-regionally focused, we are going a bit beyond the national commitments. So that's touching on the first of the three questions. I hope that is helpful information to you. I could combine the next couple of questions, which, as you had noted, Marisa, focus on, first of all, the assessment of externalities, and also the extension to other regions, which I think Mohammed has touched on well. But I would like to also note, in touching on that, I think this is certainly an area for further research and cooperation with the Islamic Development Bank specifically. And I'd also like to note that the bank has made very important contributions to a parallel effort that has been led by the SLoCaT partnership in the recently released Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report. I think I should note here that, in fact, these two reports were launched not only on the same day, but in the very same hour at COP24 in Katowice in December. And the Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report, with, again, important input on the strategy team from the Islamic Development Bank, focuses on a number of regions. So to the first of the questions, creating summaries for various global regions on progress in transport and climate change, looking again at trends, looking at the policy landscape, both policy targets set and low carbon measures implemented. So that I would also refer you to the Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report. And in that report, we also focus a bit more on health, specific impacts on health, physical activity, and air pollution. And that's, I think these are two complementary pieces that can really come together in ongoing research, as I think Ahmed had referred to at the beginning of this question and answer session. Finally, I'd like to touch on the question coming from Debashish. Thank you for that. And if I understood correctly, to sort of prioritize walking and cycling as we're talking about electric mobility and other strategies. And yeah, I guess I would reiterate on that the importance of sustainable urban mobility plans, the usefulness of expanding those across the member countries. And electric mobility is, I think, an emerging topic within the member countries. There's some exciting work being done in Jordan, for instance, on really increasing electric mobility as a low-cost solution to motorization, and also exciting to see e-bikes as shared e-bikes released in Al Gouna in Egypt. And so we're seeing good examples of electric mobility, but really feel that in bringing this in and making really keeping motorization in check, I believe, as Salim had said, we'd like to not only electrify fleets, but continue to increase options to motorization or to private motorization. And it's very important, especially in that final section on road traffic safety, that not only are our drivers safe and are driving more sustainable vehicles, but also that pedestrians, that cyclists, and that motorcycle users are also safe. And so I think it's very essential that in creating more sustainable transport systems, that we look at the safety of all user segments of these transport systems.
Thank you very much, Carl. I would like to give the floor to our colleague Salim Refes. I misunderstood Ahmed. I thought that Ahmed had made a point already on his behalf, but I can see Salim is online. So Salim, if you would like to share any comments, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marusha, and hi everyone. I'm very glad. I don't know if we can hear me well, but
yes, we can hear you very well.
Excellent. So I'm very glad to be online and to see the report being issued, and I congratulate really everyone, especially SLoCaT members and Ahmed for this great report. I think one of the things really that helps us a lot in policy making is data, and this report has gathered an amazing amount of data. I think that is very useful for us to understand really the trends and the rapidity of the changes that we're seeing in the sector. To me, for example, it was really an eye-opener to see the booming motorization that we always talk about is actually happening at a much faster pace than we think sometimes, because of the compounded effect of the graduation of lots of low-income countries to middle-income status, and also to the compounded effect of having also, cheaper car supply countries, and basically this is really worrisome for people who are advocating public transport, because it seems that it's a lost battle when you see the trend happening. But and the demographics also was compounded with that, so it's really something that we should tackle. And I think there is a need for more analytics on that specific segment, because this is really what can offset all the potential wins in terms of additional ridership on the public transport, or supplying infrastructure for public transport, or even electrification. So that's something which I would encourage the team and the bank to look also at, and how also we can regulate that supply of new cars, because it's not only a motorization, it should be a clean motorization. And that's not easy. It's easier to say than to do. So how we can develop the right products and the right incentives for that motorization to be less damaging for the environment. So anyway, I'll keep it there, but I think it's a very good starting point. It needs more activities in the future to really take each one of the proposals as a standalone policy agenda. And then it's good to have also the energy people looking at transport again as a sector of partnership, because this is where the magic will happen, hopefully, to make things working on the ground. So again, congrats everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks, Salim, because you were part of the team in ISDB as well. So we really thank you, for your time there and your contribution there. I mean, colleagues, I think that Salim has touched on a very crucial point here, which is the integrated approaches that we must have, isn't it? But that are complex to have, pointing out that nexus with the energy sector, and how many times we just stop at saying electromobility, but we don't necessarily look into what type of energy supply, the whole supply chain, and what type of energy source is moving that electric car. Excellent points here as well. The point on electromobility not being a luxury accessory, but actually being a low-cost solution that is applicable in environments of informal livelihoods and informal settlements. Absolutely. We perhaps are now pressed by the clock ticking. We have reached the hour of the webinar. I don't see any other questions coming on the chat line, or my colleagues on backstage, Nicola Medimoric from our team, who is actually keeping us safe here on the IT front. I don't see any further questions. You've been already very generous with your time joining us today. So we really hope that the presentation has illustrated that there are indeed global agreements out there that provide frameworks for climate mitigation, adaptation and sustainability action in the transport sector. But at the same time, yet Islamic Development Bank member countries are facing a series of obstacles and of challenges that constrain the implementation of these global agreements from the low carbon transport lens. Of course, we also hope that the report has passed on the message that behind the challenges there are untapped opportunities, the overarching goal being that of maximizing the impact that low carbon transport can make as a driver of shared prosperity, of social inclusion and equal opportunities, and of climate change action. We really encourage you to download the report. You can see now on your screen the two websites from which you can download it and where you can also follow us. Don't hesitate, by all means, to get in touch with us in the SLoCaT Secretariat or with ISDB colleagues if you have any technical queries. What Carl has shared with you today, both Carl and Mohammed, is a very quick glimpse into many months of work by different people. And it was also, we acknowledge, information overload. So we are here to help digest and take any technical queries you might have. And last but not least, if you don't mind me saying, please stay tuned. Stay tuned and watch out for that upcoming piece of work, that deep dive on 6 specific countries, hopefully representing different regions, sub-regions, and contexts that we are planning on releasing before the high-level political forum, so we can all be a bit prepared. Thanks again very much for taking the time of joining us today. Thanks to my colleagues, to everybody in the background as well, hoping and making these happen. And thank you to ISDB colleagues for the exciting collaboration and the many more months of collaboration ahead. Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Have a wonderful day your side, wherever latitude you're at. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marusha.